Good afternoon. So I'm delighted to have Daniel Susskind with us today. Daniel Susskind is a research professor of economics at King's College in London and a senior research associate at the Institute for Ethics and AI at Oxford University. He's the author of one of my favorite books, if you haven't read it yet, A World Without Work. He also has a new book. What's the new book? It's
Growth, a Reckoning.
The Growth, a Reckoning, which he talked about this afternoon. He's a former Kennedy Scholar at Harvard University, where he's held numerous posts in the British government, including the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, the Cabinet Office, and the Policy Unit at 10 Downing. So he's going to give a talk, a little bit of overview of some of the things that he's been working on. Go for about 40 minutes for that, and then we'll have a little fireside chat and do questions with all of you. So
terrific. Thank you very much.
Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming all the way over from London. I hope the jet lag's not too bad.
Not too bad.
Keep you adrenalized with hard questions.
Yeah.
All right.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you all, to talk to you about a world without work. And what I want to do is I want to begin with a story, the great manure crisis of the 1890s. And it should have come as no surprise. For some time in big cities like London and New York, the most popular forms of transport had relied upon horses. Hundreds and thousands of them to heave cabs, carts, wagons, wains, and a whole variety of vehicles through the streets. And with these horses came manure, and lots of it. So one enthusiastic health officer working in Rochester, New York, calculated that the horses in his city alone produced enough to cover an acre of land to about 175 feet. So almost as tall as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And apocryphally, people at the time extrapolated from these calculations to a sort of inescapably manure-filled future. A New York commentator who predicted that piles of the stuff would soon reach the height of third-story windows. A London reporter who said that by the middle of the 20th century, the streets would be buried under 9 feet of the stuff. And it said that policymakers didn't know what to do. You know, they couldn't simply ban horses from the street. They were far too economically important. But the twist in the tale is that in the end, policymakers didn't need to worry. In the 1870s, the internal combustion engine was built, the first. In the 1880s, it was installed in the first automobile. And only a few decades later, Henry Ford, of course, brought the Model T to the mass market. Cars were now a mass thing. By 1912, New York had more cars than horses. 5 years after that, the last horse-drawn tram was decommissioned in the city. The great manure crisis was over. So this parable of horses, as Elizabeth Kolber called it in The New Yorker, has been told many times over the year, and many times over the years. And in most tellings of the story, the decline of horses is cast in an optimistic light, as a tale of technological triumph. But for this man, Wassily Leontief, the Russian-American economist who would win the Nobel Prize for his work in 1973, the same event suggested a far more unsettling conclusion. What he saw was how a new technology, the combustion engine, had taken an animal that for millennia had played a central role in economic life and had banished it to the sidelines. And then in a set of articles in the early 1980s, he made one of the most infamous claims in modern economic thought. What technological progress had done to horses, he said, it would eventually do to human beings as well, drive us out of work. What cars and tractors were to them, robots and computers would be to us. Now, today, the world is gripped again by Leontief's fear. Here in the US, about 30% of workers believe their jobs are likely to be replaced by robots and computers in their lifetime. In the UK, the same proportion think it will happen in the next 25 years. And what I want to do today is to explain why I think we need to take these sorts of fears seriously. Not always their substance, as we shall see, but I think certain aspects of their spirit. Now, will there be enough well-paid work for everyone to do in the 21st century? I think this is one of the great questions of our time. And what I want to do today is explain why I think we need to take this threat of technological unemployment more seriously. And so in particular, what I want to do are 6 different things. The first is I want to set out just a little bit of the history of automation anxiety. This isn't the first time that people have worried about the impacts of technology on work. The second is that I want to say a little bit about technology in general. The third is I want to say a bit more about one technology in particular, which is artificial intelligence. It's something that has really captured people's imaginations over the last year or so. And I think there has been some hype and there has been some overexcitement, but beneath that, something interesting has happened. And I want to spend a bit of time exploring exactly what that is, why it matters so much for thinking about the future of work. And I want to explain why I think we need to take these technological challenges in the world of work seriously. I want to set out a theme that has become increasingly popular, particularly in the last few months with respect to technology, that what we ought to do is try and redirect technology to not try and slow it down, but instead pursue the sort of technology that protects good work rather than undermines it. And I want to share a few thoughts on that. And then finally, I want to close with what I think are the 3 big problems that we'll face in a world with less work, and explain how I think we ought to respond to them. So first, the economic history. Economic growth is a very recent phenomenon. In fact, for most of the 300,000 years that human beings have been around, economic life has been relatively stagnant. But over the last few hundred years, that economic activity came, as you can see, to an explosive end. The amount each person produced increased about 13-fold, and world output rocketed nearly 300-fold. So imagine that the sum of human existence was an hour long. Most of this action here happened in the last half second or so, in the literal blinking of an eye. And it was Britain that led the economic charge, thundering ahead of others in what's now known as the Industrial Revolution around the 1760s. And over the following decades, new machines were invented and put to use that greatly improved the way that goods were produced. And these technologies allowed manufacturers to operate far more productively than ever before. In short, to make far more with far less. And it's here, at the beginning of modern economic growth, that we can also detect the origins of automation anxiety. So people start to worry that using these machines to make more things would also lead to less demand for their own work as well. The anxiety that automation would destroy jobs sort of spilt out into protest and dissent. So during the Industrial Revolution, back home, technological vandalism by the so-called Luddites was, widespread. In 1812, the British Parliament felt forced to pass the so-called Destruction of Stockings Frames Act, etc. So destroying machines became a crime punishable by death, and several people were soon charged and in fact executed in Britain for destroying machines. Importantly, though, this automation anxiety wasn't confined to the 17th and 18th centuries. It continues right after that up into the present day. So in the last few years, there's been a sort of frenzy of books and articles and reports on the threat of automation. Yet even as early as the 1940s, the debate about technological unemployment was so commonplace that the New York Times felt comfortable calling it an old argument. In fact, in almost every decade since 1920, it's possible to find a piece in the New York Times engaging in some way with this threat of technological unemployment. And yet, and this is the key point, and yet most of those anxieties about the economic harm caused by these new technologies have turned out to be misplaced. So looking back over the last few hundred years, there's really little evidence to support that primary fear, that technological progress would lead to large pools of permanently displaced people. It's true that workers have been displaced by new technologies, but eventually most have found new work to do. And so the really interesting question is why? Why in the past, despite the fears of so many people, did technological progress not lead to mass unemployment, as many people worried? And the answer, when we look back on what actually happened over the last few hundred years, is that the harmful effect of technological progress on work, the one that really preoccupied our anxious ancestors, is only one half of the story. So yes, machines took the place of human beings in performing certain tasks and certain activities, but they didn't just substitute for people. They also complemented them at other tasks and activities, the tasks and activities that hadn't yet been automated, increasing the demand for human beings to do those unautomated tasks instead. And it's this helpful force, which is so often forgotten about, which works in a variety of different ways, that again increase the demand for displaced human beings to do work that hadn't yet been automated. And this complementing force works in various different ways, as I said. And for those who want a sort of some more detail on how it works, do take a look at the book, A World Without Work. I explore lots of different ways in which this complementing force helps increase the demand for displaced workers. But the key point is this, which is that distinguishing clearly between that harmful substituting force and that helpful complementing force helps to explain why those past anxieties about automation were so often misplaced. So in the clash between these two fundamental forces, our ancestors just tended to pick the wrong winner. Time and again, they either neglected that helpful complementing force altogether, or they imagined that it would somehow be overwhelmed by that harmful substituting force. And that is why they repeatedly underestimated the demand for the work of human beings that would remain. There has always been, by and large, enough to keep human beings in employment. So that, I think, is the context, and it's important context for thinking about the impact of technology on work today. And I want now to, with that background, turn to think a little bit about technology. So every day it feels like we hear stories of systems and machines that are taking on tasks and activities which, until recently, we thought only human beings alone could ever do. Making medical diagnoses and driving cars, drafting legal contracts and designing buildings, composing music and writing news reports. Given the time constraints this afternoon, I just want to focus on the general way in which I think about the technological progress that's taking place at the moment. And I think it's, although machines can clearly do more than they can in the past, they still cannot do everything. There are still clearly limits to that harmful substituting force. The problem is that the boundaries between what these machines can and cannot do are unclear, and they're always changing. And so what you see are lots of books and articles and reports that try to work out the new limits of machine capabilities, and they use lots of different approaches. So one is to try and identify which particular faculties are hard to automate. So a popular finding, for instance, is that new technologies struggle to perform tasks that require social intelligence. So face-to-face interaction, empathetic support. So if you look at the data from 1980 to 2012, jobs that require a high level of human interaction grow by about 12% as a share of the US workforce. A very different tack to identifying kind of faculties is to instead look at the tasks themselves and ask whether particular tasks and activities have features that make it more easy or less easy for a machine to handle them. So if you come across a task where it's easy to define the goal, straightforward to tell whether or not that goal has been achieved, and there's lots of data for a system to learn from, then that's the sort of task that can probably be automated. And so identifying cats is a good example of that. The goal is simple. Just answer the question, is this a cat? It's easy to tell whether the system has succeeded or not. Yes, that is indeed a cat. And there are lots of cats out there on the internet. Surprisingly disturbing number of cats, apparently 6.5 billion photos cats on the internet. But the obvious problem with trying to mark out the limits of machines in either way, either identifying faculties which are hard to automate or particular tasks which are hard to automate, is that any conclusion that you reach is going to become outdated pretty quickly. Those who try to identify these boundaries are like the proverbial painters of the Fourth Rail Bridge in Scotland, a bridge that's so long they supposedly had to start repainting it as soon as they got to the end, because by that point, the paint would have already begun to peel. So yeah, spend too much time trying to come up with a sensible account of what machines can do today, and the chances are that by the time you finish, you're probably going to have to start again and readjust. So I think a better way to think about technology, and this is what I do in my work, is to try and stop identifying particular limits. Repress that sort of desire to want to taxonomize and try to look at the deeper trends. And I think when you do that, what you see is that although it's very difficult to say exactly what machines will be capable of doing in the future, I think it's pretty certain that they're going to be able to do more than they currently do today. Over time, machines are gradually but relentlessly going to take on more and more of the tasks and the activities that at the moment only human beings alone could do. Take any technology today, look at your laptop, open your smartphone. That's the worst it's ever going to be. I call this general trend task encroachment. And when you look at the three main capabilities that human beings draw on when they do their work, whether it's manual capabilities, so those that involve the physical world, whether it's cognitive capabilities that draw on our capacity for thinking and reasoning, or affective capabilities, our capacity for feelings and emotion, what you see are machines gradually but relentlessly encroaching on more and more tasks and activities that require each of these capabilities. And if you have a look at my work, you'll see hundreds of examples of this process of task encroachment underway. I think it's important, though, just to remember that the examples that I give in my work, and that some of you will have read this week on the reading, they're not meant to be exhaustive. Some impressive ones are missing. Others, in years to come will no doubt look pretty tired. And I think the claims I'm talking about aren't meant to be, I think it's quite important that the claims that companies talk about are not taken as gospel either. I think at times it can be quite hard to distinguish serious corporate ambitions and achievements from, provocations drawn up by marketeers whose job it is to, try and exaggerate things. I think the icing on the cake for me was when someone asked at Christmas if I would like an artificially intelligent toothbrush. I'm not quite sure how intelligent you need to be to brush your teeth. But the general point here is that, if you dwell for too long on any particular omission or exaggeration, I think you're going to miss the bigger picture here, which is that these machines are gradually, again, but relentlessly encroaching on more and more tasks and activities that in the past required quite a rich range of human capabilities. Economists are pretty wary of labeling any empirical regularity as a law or as a rule. But I think, this process of task encroachment has proven to be almost as law-like as any historical phenomenon can be. Barring catastrophe, it seems pretty likely to continue. And this, I think, is, the most valuable way to think about technology in general. What I want to do now, though, is just focus on one technology in particular, which is artificial intelligence. Because I do think something really interesting has happened in the field, and I just want to spend a bit of time setting out exactly what it is, and that'll help me in explaining why I think we need to take these challenges of automation in the world of work more seriously. And the story I want to tell begins in what I call the first wave of artificial intelligence. And the first wave took place in the 1980s, and the 1980s were the time when my dad, who was my co-author in writing the first book that I wrote, The Future of the Professions, he was doing his doctorate in artificial intelligence and the law at Oxford. So almost 40 years ago, he was already trying to build systems that could solve legal problems. And something really interesting happened in the UK in 1986, which was that a very difficult piece of law was passed called the Latent Damage Act. And it turned out that the leading expert in the world at the time on this very particular piece of law was a man called Philip Capper. And Philip happened to be the dean of the law school at Oxford, where my dad was doing his doctorate. And Philip came to my dad and said, look, this is just absurd. Anytime anyone wants to understand if this law applies to them, they have to come to me. And so what he said was, look, why don't we work together, join forces, and build a system based on my expertise that people could use instead of having to come to me. And that's exactly what they did from 1986 to 1988. They worked on the development of the world's first commercially available AI system in the law. Now, this was the home screen design for the system they built. My dad assures me that this was a cool screen design in the 1980s, never been entirely convinced of that. Just to give you a flavor of what they were up against, here's an extract from the law. Section 2 of this act shall not apply to an action to which this section applies. It's a more readily understandable piece of the law. I love this, though. They published it in the form of floppy disks at a time when floppy disks genuinely were still floppy. And, you know, essentially what they did together was they built an absolutely gigantic decision tree where you answered these yes or no questions, and you navigated through a tree that had quite literally millions of branches through it that my dad and his colleagues had manually, painstakingly crafted together in the computer science lab. Now, what's interesting is that they weren't just doing this in law. This was the general approach in AI back then. And in the beginning, most people, like my dad, most AI researchers, believed that building a machine to perform a given task meant observing how a human being performed that task and then copying them. So some people tried to replicate the actual structure of the human brain. Others took a more psychological approach and tried to replicate the sort of thinking and reasoning processes that a human being appeared to be engaged in. A third thing was to try and draw out the rules that human beings seem to follow. But in all these different efforts, human beings provided the template for machine behavior in one way or another. What's interesting is that ultimately this approach of, building machines in the image of human beings didn't really succeed. And despite that kind of initial burst of optimism and enthusiasm in the 1980s, there wasn't really a lot of serious progress in artificial intelligence. And as many of you will know, as the 1980s came to an end and as the 1990s began, research interest, funding, basically progress in artificial intelligence dried up. And a period known as the AI winter began, when not a lot of progress happened in the field at all. And that first wave of artificial intelligence that had raised so many hopes ended really in failure. The turning point comes in 1997, and it's a moment that I think lots of you will be familiar with. And this is, of course, when Garry Kasparov, who at the time was the world chess champion, was beaten by a system called Deep Blue, and it was owned by IBM. Now, what's really interesting about this is that if you had gone back to the 1980s and said to my dad and his colleagues, do you think something like this will ever be possible? And remember, they were some of the most open-minded. They're some of the most ambitious, progressive people thinking about AI back then. If you had said, do you think something like this will ever be possible? They would have said to you emphatically no. We will never do it. And the reason why they would have said no is very important. The reason why they would have said no is because at the time, they were of that first wave mindset. So they thought, again, the only way to build a system to outperform a human expert is to sit down with a human expert, get that human expert to explain to you how they solve whatever problem it is you're trying to solve, and then try and capture that human explanation in a set of instructions or rules for a system to follow. But here's the problem, and Garry Kasparov is such a good example of this problem. If you sit down with Kasparov and say, look, tell me how it is you're so good at chess, he might be able to give you a few clever opening moves or closing plays, and chess fans in the room will know that that's what he does in his books and online tutorials and so on. But in the end, he'd struggle. He'd say things like it requires gut reaction, instinct, intuition, judgment, creativity, instinct. and so on. In short, he would say, I cannot articulate to you exactly how it is that I'm so good at chess. And that was why my dad and his colleagues thought something like this could never be automated. If a human being cannot articulate how they perform a task, well, where on earth do we begin? They worried, in writing a set of instructions for a machine to follow. Now, what they hadn't banked on, the mistake that they made was not to anticipate the extraordinary growth in processing power that would happen in the decades to come. So I'm using here an index of computations per second as a measure of processing power. Not a lot happening between 1850 and 1950. Only in 1950 you get what looks like a relatively linear increase in processing power. Of course, though, this is not a linear increase in processing power. The y-axis there is a logarithmic axis, each step up a tenfold increase in computational power. What you're looking at is an explosive growth in processing power. And this is what my dad and his colleagues just did not anticipate back in the 1980s. So by the time that Garry Kasparov actually sits down with Deep Blue, and remember this is more than 25 years ago, Deep Blue's already calculating up to 330 million moves a second. Garry Kasparov at best could juggle 110 moves in his head on any one turn. He was blown out the water by brute force processing power and a huge amount of data storage capability. It didn't matter, and this is the key point, it did not matter that Garry Kasparov couldn't articulate how he was so good at chess. It didn't matter. The system was able to perform the task in a fundamentally different way. It didn't need to replicate his thinking process or mimic his reasoning. So this Deep Blue result was a sort of practical victory, but it was also an ideological triumph as well. We can think of most AI researchers up until that moment as purists, closely observing human beings acting intelligently and trying to build machines like them. But that was not how Deep Blue was designed. Its creators didn't set out to copy the anatomy of human chess players, the reasoning they engaged in, or the particular strategies that they followed. Rather, they were pragmatists. They took a task that required intelligence when performed by a human being and built a machine to perform it in a fundamentally different way. And that is what, in my view, brought artificial intelligence out of its winter. It's what I call the pragmatist revolution. And a generation of systems have now been built in this pragmatist spirit, crafted to function very differently from human beings, judged not by how they perform a task, but by how well they perform it. So advances in machine translation, as many of you will know, have not come from developing a system that mimics a talented translator, but have come from companies scanning millions of human translated pieces of text to figure out correspondences and patterns on their own. Likewise, machines have learned to classify images, not by mimicking human vision or reviewing millions of previously labeled photos, not by mimicking human vision, but by reviewing millions of previously labeled photos, hunting for similarities between those and the particular photo in the question. And this is interesting from a practical point of view and from an economic point of view, because one of the things I'm really interested in is how the economic literature has, in my view, systematically underestimated the capabilities of machines. So what are the tasks of driving a car, making a medical diagnosis, or identifying a bird at a fleeting glimpse have in common? Well, these are all tasks that at one point leading economists, and until very recently, leading economists said could not readily be automated. And yet today all of them can be. Almost all major car manufacturers have driverless car programs, countless systems that can diagnose medical problems, and there's even an app developed by the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology that can tell you what a bird is at a fleeting glimpse. So what went wrong? These economists were purists, believing that machines had to copy the way that human beings think and reason to outperform them. When they were trying to determine which tasks machines could not do, they imagined that the only way to get a machine to perform a task was to sit down with a human being, get him or her to explain how they perform that task, and then write a set of instructions based on that human explanation for machines to follow. And because human beings find it so difficult to explain how they do these things, the thought was that these sorts of things couldn't be automated either. And it leads, I think, to one of the most important ideas in my work, and one of the most important ideas I want to share today, which is what I call this artificial intelligence fallacy. And you see it in lots of popular commentary on the future of work, but also more expert analysis too. And it's It's the mistaken assumption that the only way to develop systems that perform tasks at the level of human beings or higher is to somehow copy the way that human beings perform that task. Now, that might have been true 40 years ago in that first wave of artificial intelligence, but it's simply no longer the case. So let me give you a practical example. And if I were talking to an audience of professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, architects, they say, look, Daniel, that's all very interesting, but you don't understand. What I do in my work requires judgment. Okay, and judgment is the sort of thing a machine can never do. And I say this question, can a machine ever exercise judgment? It's the wrong question to be asking in light of these technological developments that I've just described. In fact, there are two more important questions. The first is this: to what problem is judgment the solution? Why do people go to doctors or lawyers or accountants or architects or whoever it might be and say, look, I need your judgment. Give me your judgment. And the answer to that question, it seems to me, is because of uncertainty. When the facts are unclear, when the information is ambiguous, when people don't know what to do, they go to their fellow human beings and say, look, I need your judgment, perhaps based on your experience, to help me make sense of this uncertainty. So really the question we should be asking, the interesting question, isn't can a machine ever exercise judgment, but it's can a machine deal with uncertainty better than a human being can? And the answer to that question, as many of you will know, is of course they can. That is precisely what they're so good at doing. They can handle far larger bodies of data than us and make sense of it in ways that we, acting alone, simply couldn't perceive. So a good example of this are the medical diagnostic systems that have been developed in the last few years. This is the one developed at Stanford that can tell you whether or not a freckle is cancerous as accurately as leading dermatologists. How does it work? It's not trying to copy the judgment of a human doctor. It knows, it understands absolutely nothing about medicine at all. Instead, it's got a database of 140,000 odd past cases. And again, it's running a pattern recognition algorithm through those cases, hunting for similarities between them and the particular photo of the troubling freckle in question. It's performing, once again, the task in an unhuman way. And it doesn't matter, and this is the key point, that a human doctor might struggle to articulate how they make a medical diagnosis. That inability of human beings to explain how they do very tricky, subtle, complex things turns out to be far less of a bottleneck on automation than many people thought was possible in the past. Can machines think? Now, I love the question from a sort of philosophical point of view, but from a more practical point of view, I just don't think it's a particularly useful question. And to see why, I want you to think of another system owned by IBM, this one called Watson, and its claim to fame, of course, was that it went on the US quiz show Jeopardy! 2011. It beats the two human champions at the game of Jeopardy! Okay, and I love this, but what I particularly like about this is that the day after Watson won on Jeopardy! The Wall Street Journal ran a terrific piece by the great philosopher John Searle with the title, "Watson Doesn't Know It Won on Jeopardy!" Right? And it's completely right. It's completely true. Watson didn't let out a cry of excitement. It didn't call up its parents to say what a good job it had done. It didn't want to go down to the proverbial pub for a drink. The system wasn't trying to copy the way that those human contestants thought or the way that they reasoned, but it didn't matter. It still outperformed them. It's what I call in my work an increasingly capable non-thinking machine. And I think that is what the second wave of artificial intelligence is about, very broadly. And that's what we're in at the moment. Systems and machines that are using remarkable advances in processing power, in data storage capability, and in algorithm design to perform tasks that might require very subtle faculties when performed by human beings, but perform them in fundamentally different ways. And the consequence of this is that, in practice, a whole realm of activity that we thought was out of reach, because it draws on subtle faculties like judgment or creativity or even empathy, that turns out not to be the case. More and more of these activities are within reach. And I think it has quite important implications for thinking about work. And I want to spend a bit of time thinking about what those implications might be. I think the challenge for now, in my view, the next sort of 5 to 10 years, is not a challenge where there aren't enough jobs to be done full stop because of technological progress. The challenge is that there is work to be done, but for various reasons, people aren't able to do that work. That seems to me to be a useful way of thinking about the challenge in the labor market due to technological progress at the moment and in the medium term. A sort of frictional technological unemployment. And I think there are, so if we think again in terms of those two forces that I mentioned before, I think, for the next decade or so in almost all economies, that harmful substituting force that displaces workers will be overwhelmed by that helpful complementing force that raises the demand for their work elsewhere. But there are three reasons that I think that increasingly in-demand work might sit out of reach of more and more workers. And I just want very briefly to explain what those are. The first reason why I think that work might sit out of reach of more and more workers is what I call the skills mismatch, where displaced workers simply don't have the skills to do the new work that has to be done, the new work created by technological progress. And I think this is the most familiar reason for sort of frictional technological unemployment, and I won't say too much more on that. The second reason, though, is what I call the place mismatch, where displaced workers just don't happen to live in the particular place where work has been created. It's worth remembering that in the early days of the internet, there was a moment when it seemed like these sorts of worries about place would no longer matter. People spoke about the death of distance and how the world is flat. But actually, in looking for work today, the place where you live matters more than ever. The third aspect, the third mismatch, and I think this is one of the ones that we spend least time thinking about, is the identity mismatch. But despite the fact we don't spend too much time thinking about it, I nevertheless think it's important. And this is where displaced workers have an identity rooted in a particular sort of work, and they're willing to stay out of work in order to protect that identity. So think of adult men here in the US displaced from traditional manufacturing roles by new technologies. So there are some people who would say that these men would rather not work at all than take up, and it's an unfortunate term, but take up so-called pink-collar work, which is a term designed to capture the fact that many of the jobs that are hardest to automate and many of the jobs in which we're going to anticipate job growth in the future are disproportionately done by women. So 97.7% of preschool and kindergarten teachers in the US are women, 92.2% of nurses, 82.5% of social workers. So those mismatches, it seems to me, are, thinking about the impact of technology on work and sort of medium term, mismatches like those feel to me to be the kind of more pressing challenge. But if you look further into the 21st century, I think we might see the emergence of a second type of technological unemployment, one where there's just simply not enough work to be done, full stop. And I think this is a less comfortable idea. It's not frictional technological unemployment, but it's structural technological unemployment. So, can this idea be right? What about the fact that after 3 centuries of radical technological change, there's still enough work for human beings to do? Doesn't that tell us there's always going to be sufficient demand for the work of human beings? And the argument that I make in the book that's on the reading list this week is that the argument is no. And the fundamental reason is because of that process of task encroachment, that if you think of those two forces that I mentioned before, I think there can be little doubt that as task encroachment continues, that harmful substituting force is only going to grow stronger. Their workers are going to be displaced from a wider range of tasks and activities than many people thought was possible in the past. Why, though, can we not simply rely upon that helpful complementing force as we have done for the last 300 odd years? And the answer, in my view, is that process of task encroachment also has a second, pretty pernicious effect, that over time, it could wear down that helpful complementing force as well. Not only strengthen the substituting force, but also wear down that complementing force. And again, for those who are interested in the sort of intricacies of that argument, do take a look at the book. I just want to, take the premise for now as given that structural technological unemployment is a threat and explore what it might mean and what we should do about it. So there is an increasingly popular response at the moment, which is that we ought to try and redirect technological change. So The argument being that our current path of technological progress might be leading us to a world of structural technological unemployment, where there isn't enough good work for people to do, but we can avoid that path if we want to, and we can choose a different technological path if we want to. And I think the clearest articulation of this is in the work of Daron Acemoglu, which is captured nicely in his recent book. He accepts that what he calls excessive automation is underway, but he argues again that we can avoid that path and we can take a different path to the one we're currently on if we want to. And I think the key idea here is a really valuable one. It's a really important one. Often when politicians and policymakers talk about technological progress, it's as if we're on a train. We can push forward on the throttle and speed up and get more technological progress. We can pull back on the throttle and slow down and get less technological progress. But the direction of travel is sort of predetermined. It's fixed by the tracks, and all we've got to do as a society is just sort of trundle along those tracks. And the spirit of the argument that Acemoglu makes, the spirit of this idea of directed technological progress, is that this is wrong. That a much better metaphor is not the sort of train metaphor, but it's a nautical one. Now the picture is that policymakers are sort of bobbing about on the open water. They can raise their sails to speed up progress. They can lower them to slow down, but we can also steer our boat wherever we please on the sea. And it's a sort of far more liberating metaphor. We're not confined to the kind of narrow task of just deciding whether or not we want more technological progress or less technological progress, but we can change the sort of character of technological progress, the type, and we can chart a very different course if we want to. So, the question is, what direction should we be heading in? What direction, if we can redirect technological progress, should we, want to go in? And in the simple story, thinking about technology can either substitute for workers or complement workers, there's two paths. Either we go down a path where we encourage the development of technologies that substitute for workers, and that is a path that many people worry we are on. And we can, on this path, people develop technologies that replace workers. Or instead, there's another path that we can go down, and this is the path we ought to be going down, which is that we develop technologies which help workers, that complement them. And so the big question is, well, how do we choose that path? If we want to go down a different path, if we want to sort of steer away from a problem of structural technological unemployment, how do we encourage the development of technologies in society that complement human beings rather than substitute for them? And the answer is that through taxes and subsidies, through laws and regulations, through social norms and customs, this is the argument that these are the tools that we can use to redirect technological progress. By tweaking and changing these things, we can change the incentives that people face in society and encourage them not only to develop more technologies, but again, to develop technologies that complement workers rather than substitute for them. And just to see one example of this, in the US, every single year since 1981, the effective tax rate that business leaders have to pay to hire workers has been far higher than the effective tax rate on using machines. So the result is a very strong incentive to develop technologies that, again, substitute for workers rather than complement them. And the argument is that, look, this is the sort of thing that we can change if we want to. We can change the sort of incentives that exist in society, encourage the development of technologies that complement workers rather than substitute for them. And in principle, I'm pretty sympathetic with that idea. Indeed, my new book argues that there are sort of broader applications for this, that we ought to think not only about redirecting AI and think of redirecting it away from harming workers and harming kind of politics and so on, but we ought to think about how we can redirect technological progress more generally to protect other things that we might care about, whether it's the environment, whether it's the level of inequality in society, whether it's the health of local places and communities. So I start from the point of view of thinking that this idea of redirecting technological progress is quite a useful one. But I also think it's got limits. And I think to see those limits, it's worth thinking about the environmental case. So here you have, like with automation, a technology that technologies that can be harmful, in the sense that we have technologies which are dirty, they pollute, they emit carbon dioxide. But there's another path where we have technologies which are not dirty, but technologies that are clean. Green technologies, ones that don't do as much damage to the environment. And what we have done over the last 30, 40 years or so through taxes and subsidies, through laws and regulations, through social norms and customs, is to try and change the sorts of technologies that get developed in society, to encourage people to develop clean technologies rather than dirty ones. And so again, rather than substitute and complement, we've here got dirty and clean, and we've tried to encourage people to develop clean technologies. And to some extent, we've had some success in that. But I don't think anyone could argue that we have been successful enough. If you think about the rise in global temperatures, the last 8 years have been the hottest 8 years on record in Earth's history. Despite the fact that we have known what we need to do to redirect technological progress with respect to the climate, despite the fact we have known what we needed to do to encourage people to develop clean technologies rather than dirty ones. So there's something like a carbon tax of about $100 per metric ton of carbon by 2030 is thought to get us on a path to develop, to keeping temperature rises under control. We have failed to do so. So we have a strategy now with respect to the climate, which is in part mitigation, encouraging the redirection of technological progress, encouraging the development of technologies that are clean rather than dirty. But we've also had to accept that our strategy has to involve adaptation too, that there are limits to our capacity to redirect technological progress, and that we're going to have to live on a warmer planet as well. And I think a similar lesson applies to thinking about AI and this challenge of structural technological unemployment. Yes, we can try to shape the direction of technological progress, and I think that's a good thing to do. Encourage the development of technologies that complement rather than substitute for human workers. But I think we have to accept that there are immense political and technical difficulties with doing that. And as with what's happened with the climate over the last 40 years, we have to accept that our strategy with respect to the impact of AI on work has to be not only mitigation, but also adaptation as well. So that's just another reason why I think that we need to take these challenges of a world potentially with less work more seriously, that our capacity to sort of choose a different path, well, I think it's something we should certainly try to do, is constrained. So let me share some thoughts in the last few minutes on the problems that we might face in a world with less work. And I think there are three big problems that we need to think through if we take seriously the prospect of a world with less work. And the first is the economic problem, which is the problem of inequality. Today, the labor market is the main way that we share our income in society. For most people, their job is their main, if not their only, source of income. So how do we share out material prosperity in society when the traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, is less effective than it might have been in the past? Now, in my work, I argue that the only way we can do this is through the state, that we need a big state. Now, the important point here is that what I have in mind is not a big state of production. It's not teams of people sitting in central government offices trying to kind of command and control economic affairs from a distance. We tried that in the 20th century. It didn't work very well. What I have in mind is a big state of distribution, a state that takes a larger role in sharing out income in society. If our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, is less effective than it was in the past. The second problem actually has little to do with economics, and it's the problem of power. In the future, I think our lives are likely to become dominated by a small number of large technology companies who are responsible for developing these technologies. Now, what's interesting about this power that these technology companies have is that I think the nature of the power has changed over time. In the 20th century, our main preoccupation was with the economic power of large companies. we worried about things like market concentration, predatory pricing, and so on and so on. And we had tools and for identifying concentrations of economic power and intervening where appropriate to break up those concentrations of power. What I think is important in thinking about the 21st century is that we are going to be far less worried with the economic power of large companies and far more concerned with their political power and the impact they have on things like liberty and democracy and social justice and whether or not those things are under threat. So just to think about those a little more. Today, technologies increasingly constrain our liberty. A seller can be blocked from advertising certain goods in an online market. A cryptocurrency holder can forget their wallet key and lose their fortune to the blockchain. An electric bike rider can be forced from going above a certain speed, even if there's an emergency at hand. Technologies determine questions of social justice. Algorithms which decide which applicants get a job, which citizens get social housing, which borrowers receive financial loans, which prisoners are released on parole. And technologies also shape our democracy. Search engines sort and shape what information we receive. Online media platforms sift and select which conversations we take part in. Social networks determine who is amplified and who is muted. I think these issues around the political power that these large technology companies have, in particular the impacts they have on things like liberty, social justice, democracy, are going to dominate our concerns about power in the 21st century in the same way that concerns about economic power dominate our worries about large companies in the 20th. The third and final challenge is the challenge of meaning and purpose. There is a joke that I like about a Jewish mother and her son, and they're swimming, and the son is swimming and he's out at sea and he's clearly struggling. He's going underwater, and the mum standing on the shore says, "Help, my son, the doctor, is drowning." And I like that because it captures quite nicely this idea that work for many people is not simply a source of income, but it's also a source of meaning and direction and fulfillment and purpose. And if that's right, then the challenge of automation, the challenge of this idea of structural technological unemployment, isn't just that it might hollow out the labor market, leaving some people without an income, but it might also hollow out that sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment that people have in life too. And this leads, I think, to some of the most radical things that I've written about, which are does the state have a role in shaping how people spend their spare time? We have designed a huge variety of interventions for shaping people's working lives, labor market policies. Do we need to think in the 21st century about leisure policies, how we shape for good or bad, how people spend their spare time as well? So let me just finish now on a note of optimism. And I do remain optimistic, and optimism is a sort of running theme in my work. And the reason is simple, which is that in decades to come, technological progress is likely to solve the economic problem that has dominated humanity until now. So if we think of the economy as a pie, the traditional challenge has been how to make that pie large enough for everyone to live on. So at the turn of the first century AD, if the global economic pie had been divided up into equal slices for everyone in the world, most people would have just got a few $100s. Almost everyone lived on or around the poverty line. And if you rolled forward 1,000 years, roughly the same would have been true. But over the last 300 years, and as we saw right at the start, economic growth has soared. And this growth was driven by technological progress. Economic pies around the world have exploded in size. So global GDP per head today, the value of those individual slices is already about $11,000, $12,000. We have come very close again to solving that economic problem that has plagued humankind for centuries. And this idea of technological unemployment, in a sort of strange way, will be a symptom of that success. That in the 21st century, this technological progress will solve one problem, how to make the pie large enough for everyone to live on, but it will replace it with three others. Those problems, that problem of inequality, about how we share out this income if we can't rely upon our traditional way of doing so, the problem of power, and in particular, the political power of large technology companies. And third, this issue of meaning and purpose. And I think clearly there's going to be immense disagreement about how we should meet these challenges, about how to share out prosperity, about how to constrain the political power of big tech, how to provide meaning in a world with less paid work. But these are, it seems to me, in the final analysis, just far more attractive problems to have to grapple with and to have to try and solve than the one that haunted our ancestors for centuries, which was how to make the pie large enough in the first place. So I will finish there. Thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to taking questions.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, just sit here.
Right here. So that was terrific. Thanks for that overview. Let me take a few minutes to just talk about those last three problems that you talked about, and we'll open it up to discussion or ask you about them. So the first one about inequality, and if people aren't, some work can be a pain, but it's also a way most people get income. So if you don't have that, then you talked about a big state for distribution. Yeah. One of the other readings was Sam Altman's Moore's Law for Everything. I'm sure you read it at some point. And he didn't imagine a big state. He imagined, WorldCoin or some UBI that distributed. Maybe you could say a little bit about just say a little bit more about how inequality might be addressed with or without a big state, and whether or not what your thoughts are about a universal basic income.
Yeah. So I mean, the challenge of a world with less work is that on the one hand, these technologies, as I was saying, will make us kind of collectively more prosperous than ever before. But at the same time, they undermine the traditional way in which we've shared out that prosperity through paid work. And so the challenge, the kind of high level challenge is, okay, well then how do you move from a world where we have traditionally taxed what is valuable, the work that people do, or we have taxed and that's how we raised the money and then redistributed it. If we move from a world in which human capital is less valuable to a world in which other types of capital are more valuable, it seems to me that we need to find a way to either tax those increasingly valuable other types of capital, whether it's particular technologies that we're talking about, or find a way to give other people ownership in those technologies. Those feel to me to be either we're going to have to find a way to tax those valuable types of capital and redistribute it through some kind of basic income, as you say, or we need to give people direct ownership of those sorts of that valuable capital. And I can't see how you can do either of those things without the state in some way taking a larger role in both of those tasks. And that's what leads me to this idea of the big state. It's not a big state of production, it's a big state of distribution.
Big state in terms of power, but it doesn't necessarily need like rows of people like you were showing.
No, that's right. So it's not like kind of big state of
Social Security doesn't require much of bureaucracy.
Exactly, that's right. On the issue of basic income, I mean, I write quite a bit about it. I mean, I have issues with lots of aspects. I can see the appeal, which is that it solves this distributional problem. How do you share our income if you can't rely upon the labor market to do it? Well, a basic income gives everybody a slice of the pie without being conditional on their status in the labor market. And so I can see the appeal. I mean, I have various problems with it. One is it's not obvious it needs to be in the form of an income. And so I think these, and Sam Altman is, a proponent of in that piece of the idea that it ought not to be an income, it ought to be some kind of basic equity in these technologies. I think there are really difficult questions about, so I think there's issues around the I think there's issues around the B, how basic is basic. Both the left and the right at various moments in history have agreed with in principle with the merits of a basic income. But if you look at what they mean by basic, it's very different. So those on the right who have supported it because it promises sort of simplification of the tax system. And what they mean by basic is very little, a floor beneath which no one can fall. Whereas those on the left who have supported something far more ambitious, a basic that allows people to really flourish in life. So I think there's kind of difficult conversations about basic. My bigger issue is about the universality, this idea that it comes with no strings attached. And for many people, it's the sort of defining feature of the basic income, but I think it's the most kind of problematic feature. And the reason is this, and we were talking about it earlier, which is that, in my view, social solidarity today comes from a feeling that everybody is pulling their economic weight through the work that they do and the taxes that they pay. And if people aren't in work, there's an expectation that they ought to look for work if they're able to work. And the problem with a basic income is that it just, offends that sense of social solidarity. It means some people are taking from the collective pot without giving anything in return. And so, in other words, I think, a basic income does a very good job of solving these issues of distributive justice about how you share our income fairly in society, but it neglects these issues of contributive justice about how you give people an opportunity to contribute to the collective pot and, most importantly, be seen by others to contribute. And so I think there does need to be, if we do end up with something like a basic income, there does need to be some sort of conditionality, although it can't be conditional on fulfilling paid work. People have to be given an opportunity to pay into that collective pot in some non-economic way, doing other types of socially valuable activities.
Well, that does raise some questions about, in the book you talk about conditional.
Yes, that's right.
Conditional basic income, which, would be conditioned on them contributing.
Yeah.
I want to come back to that in the meaning, which is the third big question. But let's go to the second one first, which is around power.
Yeah.
And you talked about a big state in order to enforce this.
Yes.
And one of the concerns I would have about a basic income, I can see that all the benefits you mentioned, but is that it inherently sort of centralizes a lot of power.
Yes.
At that point, the people who are receiving the income are sort of dependent on the benevolence or the legislature, whatever. When labor is the basis of their income, then if somebody doesn't pay them, they stop working, and then the other side doesn't get their benefit of their labor. If the factory shuts down, if the workers don't show up, if they need labor. But if you don't need labor anymore, then there's that bargaining power isn't there anymore. And I wonder, I'm not a political scientist, but with that loss of economic bargaining power comes loss of political bargaining power, and at some point you sort of become at the mercy of kindness or altruism of the people who are providing the basic income. It seems like it might be unstable. There are people who talk about a so-called useless class or whatever, and you can imagine that turning negative. Is that a concern, the centralization of power that comes with that? And do you have any ways of addressing it?
Well, I mean, I think it's also not a problem that kind of looms in the distance. I mean, it's something, if you think about what technology is doing to lots of types of work today, making it, more insecure, 0-hour contracts, there's a sense in which already today technology is undermining the sort of voice of, labor. So I think this is, it's a continuation of a trend. I think one of the interesting responses to that is...
Well, the trend, you can argue that the longer term trend was that labor got more powerful compared to, slaves and serfs, but maybe now turning the other way so that sort of the heyday of labor is passing.
The age of labor is passing. I mean, that is one of the merits of a very different type of approach. Rather than having a basic income where you give people an income, you instead give people a stake in these companies, a stake in these technologies. Sort of
Sam Altman, other people have tried to argue that.
That's right. That you're sort of, you're a shareholder and you have a voice in, how these technologies are developed and
I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know how different that is. It's sort of like, I guess in Singapore, we talked about this earlier, you own your savings, your retirement accounts that the government, and it's sort of linked to you, ownership. So it kind of gives you a little bit more of a call on those income streams. But at the end of the day, it's not like if someone were to change the contract, you
wouldn't have any real recourse.
Yeah, and so I think that's exactly right, and it's to this point that I think that a lot of the big challenges that if we do find ourselves in a world with less work, the challenges are less to do with economic power and more to do with the kind of political consequences of the sort of that the political power of these technologies.
Well, those are some important issues. Let me come to meaning, because I want to leave some time for student questions as well. So we were talking earlier in your book. You have this great some quotes from Bertrand Russell about in praise of idleness. And Mustafa Suleyman, who I guess he spoke last year in this class, not this year, he's been a fan of universal basic income because he thinks it'll lead to a flourishing of arts and sciences and creative income, creative endeavors. So it is so far from sort of losing meaning. You know, Bertrand Russell and Suleyman think that this would be a way to encourage more creativity and fulfillment. What do you think about that side of the argument?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, there's also the case that for many people, although I made quite strongly the argument that work is an important source of meaning and purpose for people, actually, if you look at kind of polling data, for many people, work is not a source of meaning and purpose. Many people would rather not work and get their income from elsewhere. And
the standard economic model is that work is something disutility.
And if you look
not for professors, thankfully.
So I think part of the story is that actually there's quite a lot of heterogeneity. That actually the relationship between work and meaning is murkier than many people commonly suppose, and it changes over time. On the question of whether or not with more spare time it could lead to sort of people finding more meaning and purpose. I mean, I think it's a possibility. There's also the possibility that people just end up sitting around playing video games and
what's wrong with that?
And what's wrong with that? Yeah. And so this is and this is why I think it raises these really interesting questions about what the state's role is with respect to people's spare time. If we are talking about a world in which people have a stake in these technologies, some kind of share, or they get a basic income, what sort of conditions are attached to that economic support? Do people need to do socially valuable and important activities, and as part of they can spend part of their spare time playing video games, but they also have to volunteer, or they have to engage in local politics, or these are the sorts of
sounds pretty bossy.
And depending on what part of the world you raise these ideas.
Well, it would be interesting. I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Is for I don't know, maybe this research exists, is to look at people who have a lot of leisure and see how they spend their time. When do they have a sense of meaning? And people who win the lottery, or people who retire, or people who have oil wealth, or whatever. There are groups of people.
Bertrand Russell.
Well, there's a whole class of people in the UK then and now, I guess, who inherit a lot of wealth, and some of them, seem to be pretty fulfilled. They don't necessarily. Feel a lot of angst about not working.
I mean, I think part of it is that this is just such an unfamiliar, strange, and kind of troubling question. I mean, we saw it a bit. We were talking earlier about the pandemic and how the book is called A World Without Work, and how.
And you came out in 2020.
Came out in January 2020, and then the pandemic really started to bite in March 2020 in the UK. And
it was predictive of what was going to happen a few months later.
I got the cause of A World Without Work wrong, but it wasn't that robots took everyone's jobs. It was that people woke up and found that the virus had just decimated the demand for so much of the work that people did, and so we found ourselves in a world with less work. And we had to, grapple with lots of the challenges that I was talking about.
We got a basic income, sort of?
We had a basic income. We had a furlough scheme in the UK. We had, checks in the US. And but what was interesting was on the meaning and purpose part, which was that one of the things I found so fascinating was the sort of frantic scramble that people found themselves in to try and find meaning and purpose in the sort of enforced idleness under lockdown. So I don't know what it was like here, but in the UK, DIY shops ran out of paint, and you couldn't get timber for fencing because everyone had suddenly just, there was a sort of national shortage of yeast because everyone had become bread makers. There was a real, and it was, there's ways in which it's kind of amusing, but there's also something quite troubling about it, which is that I think we have a good sense collectively as a society of what it means to be in gainful employment. I don't think we have a good sense of what it looks like to be in gainful unemployment. And
well, a lot of us, have been acculturated that, working is what you're going to do during the day. And if we put an equal amount of effort into other, ways of having people get meaning beyond that, it might be successful. But we don't have much time, so let's get some questions. Let's start right here. Go ahead.
It'd be really interesting as well.
And just say your name.
Name
a little bit about
and what you do. Yeah.
Hello, I'm a master's student in MSME. I'm doing a bit of work with mechanism design.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in your how you feel about how, I guess, a future without work would affect crime.
Yeah.
Because legal employment and legitimate work has been correlated with reducing crime rates. I was wondering how you feel like, the nature of climate change as we transition to a world where, I guess, people have fewer jobs to do.
Voltaire said, work solves three great evils, boredom, vice, and need. So we climb in the second category.
Yeah. I think it's quite difficult to think of something like crime. So it's a really interesting question. And I think you could ask it for lots of different social phenomena. It's quite difficult to think about them in isolation from the particular solutions that you come up with for those problems that I set out. If you solve the distributional problem and everyone has an income, independent of their status in the labor market, if you solve the meaning and purpose problem so people don't feel, bored and idle and without direction and fulfillment, then my answer to that question would look very different to a society where people don't have access to a reliable income and are frustrated and without direction and purpose. So I think the response to that in part depends upon how effectively we respond to those challenges.
Let's take some other questions quickly right here. And then we'll go to the other side of the room.
I'm a computer science PhD student working on AI robotics. My question was related to more immediate changes for regulation about AI technology, because even currently AI is massively causing shifts in the economy. For example, recently I saw this video about someone complaining that this graphic designer was complaining that AI was just completely taking over his job. And then you can talk about building technologies to complement instead of replace humans. But under the current capitalist system, perhaps that kind of means that your technology has to be in this middle ground where it's not good enough to completely replace humans, unless there is some sort of significant form of regulation, as I said. But the problem is a lot of government today is pretty inefficient at doing this. So, for example, the current AI Safety and Security Board that the US government recently announced, one thing that's kind of weird about this is that it has this notorious lack of AI ethics academics in the field. It's all CEOs of big tech companies who have a financial incentive to drive the laws in their ways, right? So given all this information, I'm just wondering what you think is the best step that governments or society should be doing to regulate AI as of now to minimize economic harm and harm for taking other people's jobs.
So a really interesting set of observations. I agree with you about the kind of technical challenges of trying to steer these technologies in a particular direction, to try and encourage the development of technologies that complement rather than substitute. I also agree with you about the political economy challenges, which is that even if you know what to do, and you can argue that that's the situation we found ourselves in with the environment, politically it can be often very difficult to do that. And the sorts of failures that you're pointing towards, I think, are indicative of the kind of political economy challenges with responding to these effectively. I think for now, and I think it's important to be clear about this, the challenge is not a world, and I think it's distinction between frictional and structural technological unemployment is useful. The challenge for the moment is not a world without any work, full stop. The challenge is that there is work, but for various reasons that work might sit out of reach of people. But I also think there are, I spoke a lot today about the quantity of work that's available to be done in the labour market, but there are also other margins on which technology affects work. The quality of work, not just how well paid it is, but how secure it is, how fulfilling or meaningful it is. And I think there are lots of pretty established ways of thinking about labour market protection and protecting workers that apply now that we can use to make sure that the transition over the next 5 to 10 years is one that protects and supports workers. I do think, and this is a theme of the book and a theme of what I've said today, which is that I think our capacities for redirecting technology are more limited than many people assume. And I also think, given the sorts of technological advances that are taking place, we need to attach a serious possibility to finding ourselves not in a world where there is work but people can't do it for various reasons, but there isn't enough work, full stop. And that requires very different types of interventions and regulations to the ones that I think are appropriate for now.
Let's get another couple questions in real quick.
Yeah.
How about right up in the front here, right here? And then, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks.
Real quick question.
Okay, super quick question. Hi. I study economics and sociology, and I was really curious about, you were talking about how many economists were purists in considering the capabilities of machines, and I think right now a lot of economists are drawing the line of the kind of work that AI can do at like emotional capacity of these systems, but even that we see very rapidly changing. So do you think that even right now, like we are underestimating AI's ability to, in the future, take roles such as kindergarten teachers or nurses or social workers or therapists?
Yeah. Why don't we do all three right there? I think you had one. And just ask your questions. You can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a policy student. So your presentation made me think about the work of Daniel Gabor on the big green state. So I'd be curious what your vision is for the big state, especially if it needs to own computing facilities of its own. And then also Aaron Beninoff, who I think differs from you in prescription and prediction potentially. And curious how you account for some of these critiques of capitalism in your work.
Yeah. We'll just get the last question. Yeah, okay, then you can take last.
I'm a PhD student in the department here. Very simple question. I'm just curious, how specifically do you propose to regulate AI now? And why regulate AI right now when unemployment is like 3.5% and we have a productivity crisis, as opposed to like regulating later need be in these structural unemployment in chunks become apparent that they don't have to do right now.
Yeah, so I let me go backwards. I mean, I agree with you. The idea of regulating AI at the moment because of the threat that it poses to, to unemployment, I think is misplaced. That really isn't the sort of the argument that I'm making, that I think this is that the challenge of a world without work, full stop, is the challenge that we face now. I think the reasons to regulate AI at the moment are related to, for instance, some of those political considerations that I mentioned, the impact that these technologies are having on things like liberty and social justice and, democracy. And then with respect to the impact that these technologies are having on some of the other dimensions in which technology affects work, for instance, the quality of work. So, the fact that these technologies, for instance, partly as a consequence of working from home, have increased the surveillance of workers. If you're a white-collar worker sitting at home, your boss can follow where your cursor goes on the screen and see how much time you spend on different browsers. That's the sort of thing that I think needs to be regulated. You're not intervening because you think these technologies are going to lead to a world in which imminently people are going to wake up without work. That said, I do think that is a challenge we need to take seriously, as a challenge for thinking about the rest of the century. And you might argue, I may drew the comparison with climate change, where we are now with AI and its impact on kind of politics and work is where we were in the 1980s, and thinking about the impact that technology has on the climate. And I think one of the really interesting questions when we were talking about it earlier is, what given we have failed to respond adequately to that challenge, what lessons can we learn in thinking about redirecting technology today and thinking about the impact of these technologies on the labour market. On the question of emotions, I think it's really interesting. I mean, one of the first book that I wrote was on the future of the professions, the future of white-collar workers, lawyers, doctors, teachers, accountants. And it was a common observation, which was that, look, these technologies will never do what I do because, people come to me for the personal touch, the human interaction. One observation is that there is, as many people in the room will know, a fascinating field of affective computing designed to develop machines that both detect and respond to human emotions. So systems can, more accurately than human beings, distinguish between a face showing genuine joy and a face of social conformity, a smile of social conformity. We already have technologies that can do that kind of stuff. So they're very good at the kind of affective part of emotional interaction, being able to detect and respond to emotions. The kind of cognitive aspect, being able to actually feel these emotions is a bigger challenge. The observation I'd make here is, though, that I think in many cases, and none of this is meant to underestimate the value that I think empathy and human interaction has, but I think in many cases, particularly in the world of the professions, we overstate the case. I was once talking to a group of accountants, and a particularly boisterous accountant stood up and said, "Daniel, you don't understand. What I do in my work requires, the personal touch, human interaction. My clients come to me because they want to look me in the eye. They want the comforting hand on the shoulder." And I said, that isn't why your clients come to you. They come to you because they want their taxes done efficiently and effectively. And if they can find a better way of doing it that doesn't involve human interaction, then they're going to do that instead. The point being that we often confuse the traditional way in which we solve problems, namely one-to-one, face-to-face human interaction, with the problem itself. And I think what technology is doing is that actually it's showing that for many things, we are able to solve those problems without relying upon our traditional process, face-to-face, one-to-one interaction. I think there are cases where the very thing that we value is face-to-face interaction. That's the outcome that we want to achieve. It's not, if you think about end-of-life care, for instance, there is, the very thing that we value is the fact that there's a human being sitting there interacting with us. And for those things, I think it's quite difficult to see how we might do them differently in the medium term. But I think there are lots of things where we overstate the importance of human interaction. On the issue of sort of capitalism, I mean, there's a lot to say about this, but in short, and I write a lot about this in my new book. I think I really don't think we ought to be throwing capitalism out the window. I think the market system and prices and the incentives that we can create in the market are extraordinarily powerful, not only in encouraging people to develop technology, but also by changing those incentives, encouraging people to develop particular types of technology. And I think if we're going to solve many of the big challenges that we face, whether it's the impact of AI on work, or whether it's climate change, or whether it's growing inequalities in society, the market is the best mechanism that we have for solving those problems.
All right. Well, thank you for flying over an ocean and a continent to see us. I appreciate it very much.